Space, as Douglas Adams once helpfully informed us, is really big. Now, despite this inconvenient obstacle, humanity has dreamed of voyaging into its farthest reaches from the moment the monolith first taught a hominid how to throw a bone. The sheer vastness of the universe has forced science fiction writers to make choices. One common choice has simply been to cheat. If your story doesn't ask your readers to care about things like general relativity and the absolute limit of the speed of light, then writers get to imagine warp drives and hyperspace and other forms of FTL travel, and audiences don't even care. Science fiction, after all, is a literature of the imagination, and if you can't imagine your way around science, then what's even the fun of science fiction in the first place? But hard science fiction writers enjoy a challenge, to put it mildly. If you rule out wormholes and faster-than-light travel, then what other options are available if you want to send people hundreds or even thousands of light years away from the cradle of Mother Earth into the infinite void? Probably the most popular answer to this is the generation ship, and it has been a recurring trope in science fiction for decades. Hello again, everyone, and welcome, after too long an absence, back to SFF180. Thomas here, your host, as always. Thank you once again for joining me. So for the handful of you not yet versed in any of this, a generation ship is a massive vessel designed to hold hundreds or even thousands of potential colonists, with the idea that the distant descendants of the original crew will be the ones to reach the journey's final destination. Now, from a storytelling standpoint, writers can take any number of approaches, exploring politics and government, anthropology, history, art and culture, family and social dynamics, or maybe everyone just bumps into some scary aliens or other cosmic hazard. You already know that I love space opera, but I have a particular fondness for generation ship stories because while many of them naturally have recurring themes, writers over the years still manage to find fresh approaches, distinctive ways to use generation ships to comment on the human condition, while offering deep space sense of wonder thrills. So starting this week and then off and on throughout the rest of the year, I'll be making videos on generation ship stories. They will get their own playlist. Now, some of these videos will be individual book reviews in my usual style. Those will generally be new and recent releases, and then some longer form videos will discuss several books at once. Popular gen ship classics or obscure titles that have fallen down the memory hole of publishing, but deserve to be rediscovered. But in this episode, I wanted to talk about the origins of the concept itself. Where did the idea of the generation ship come from? How far back does it go? Quite a long way back, in fact. But first, let's take a quick detour into the world of science fact and pay a visit to the grandfather of rocket science himself, Robert Goddard. Robert Hutchings Goddard was born in 1882, and from a very young age, he was obsessed with space travel, which is a hell of a thing to be obsessed with, at a time when most people were getting around in horse-drawn carriages and the Wright brothers had not yet taken flight. In 1901, at the age of 19, Goddard wrote an essay titled The Navigation of Space, which essentially laid out his earliest ideas about rocketry and space travel, and more or less set the course of his life to come. Now, over the next couple of decades, he committed himself to the grind, earning his PhD in physics in 1911. He was undaunted by at least one nasty bout with tuberculosis, and also endless critics who dismissed his ideas largely based on what was conventional wisdom at the time, the false belief that thrust wasn't possible in vacuum. Now, Goddard eventually designed, built, and successfully tested the very first launch of a liquid-fueled rocket on March 16th, 1926, which is great, but Where do generation ships come in? Well, for Goddard, you'll remember space and space travel was his life's passion. And it was just a conviction of his that humanity's fate lay among the stars. In 1918, Goddard wrote a manuscript which, very interestingly, he kept sealed away among his personal papers, where it remained unpublished until November of 1972, fully 27 years after his death. Goddard called it The Ultimate Migration, and it contains what he called his, quote, most extreme speculations about space travel. Now, in Goddard's own words, a manuscript I wrote on January 14th, 1918, speculated as to the last migration of the human race, as consisting of a number of expeditions sent out into the regions of thickly distributed stars, taking in a condensed form all the knowledge of the race, using either atomic energy or hydrogen, oxygen, and solar energy. Now, what he is referring to here is an end of civilization scenario in which the human race, as the sun is dying, boards vessels bound for deep space in search of a new home. Now, it all gets, non-scientific pretty quickly, with Goddard dreaming up something he called intra-atomic energy, your guess is as good as mine, as the ideal propulsion for such a ship. Goddard then imagines various scenarios for how the crew would undertake the voyage, one of which does involve a multi-generational crew, though he expressed concern that later generations would do what all kids and grandkids and great-grandkids do, and abandon the ideals and goals of their ancestors in favor of their own. The idea that a 5th or 6th or 15th generation starship crew would simply be so adapted to life on board their vessel that the very thought of colonizing a planet would be a hard no has definitely not been lost on SF writers. Some of Goddard's alternative ideas are kind of hilarious. He actually entertained the thought not just of putting the crew in suspended animation, but freeze-drying them, like bags of fruit, or even reducing them to a powdered form, which he referred to as granular protoplasm. Now, it's true that the first astronauts drank a lot of Tang, but I have to admit, the idea of turning the astronauts themselves into Tang was not on any of my bingo cards. But if it made sense to Robert Goddard, who am I to criticize? After all, the man invented rocket science. Another pioneering scientist in space travel was the Russian Constantine Silkovski, who was thinking about rockets as far back as the early 1880s, when Robert Goddard was just being born. Now, while he never got around to building a working rocket, Silkovski did a lot of revolutionary work in the field of aerodynamics, and he theorized such concepts as multi-stage rocket boosters, using thrust to steer rockets, airlocks, space stations, space colonies, and even a space elevator. While I don't think there's any record of Tsiolkovsky theorizing a generation ship, he did provide a kind of philosophical bedrock, a notion of humankind's manifest destiny in space. So, the idea of human beings voyaging into space with no plan to return on ships that are essentially self-contained worlds, and a lot of early generation ship stories use the term worldship, has been around since the beginning. Now, where do we first see it in science fiction? Now, though it isn't the earliest, I'm going to work a bit backwards here, the story that is generally considered the first proper generation ship story, and that the focus of the plot is the journey and the dramatic changes that impact a starship crew over the span of many generations, can be found here, in the October 1940 issue of Amazing Stories. The Voyage That Lasted 600 Years was written by a guy named Don Wilcox. His real name was Cleo Eldon Wilcox, and he taught creative writing at Chicago's Northwestern University for a while, and lived to the ripe old age of 94, dying in the same town where he was born, Lucas, Kansas. The Voyage That Lasted 600 Years is an oddball little relic of its day. Yeah, a lot of it is extremely cringe, but it still has a brisk readability that makes it historically worth checking out if you're someone interested in the golden age of science fiction. Now, it's the story of the SS Flashaway, an American vessel lifting off in the year 2066 for a distant system named Robinello. One crew member, the 28-year-old Professor Gregory Grimstone, is the keeper of the traditions. Now, he'll be the one person on board making the voyage in cold sleep, waking up once every century to, I guess, see how everybody's doing, and ensure that the crew aren't losing sight of the original mission, which is to found a successful and true American colony on a distant world. Kinda dumb to give that job to a guy who overslept and missed his own wedding, and one of Wilcox's sillier contrivances is to have Grimstone's jilted bride turn up as one of the crew, only to get together with someone else. Tough break, dude. Anyway, Grimstone wakes up every 100 years as scheduled, naturally to find out that each time some new crisis is at hand. Everyone's had way too many babies, and then they're not having enough babies, and then violent family feuds are breaking out. Sometimes he wakes up to be greeted as a savior, other times as the monster who ruined everything with his meddling. Wilcox, of course, is muddling through the theme that will become dominant in future generation ship stories, which is the people are gonna people, and you can't micromanage the evolution of a society. Things are just gonna go however they go, despite whatever 600-year plan you've idealistically drawn up. There are far too many variables that can come into play over the passage of centuries, and it's a fool's game to expect the distant descendants of your original crew to have the same goals and values as their great-great-grandparents. In a generation ship, you aren't just dealing with a crew, but a population, and those develop along trends that simply cannot be outlined hundreds or thousands of years in advance by people who won't live to see the outcome. Grimstone is supposed to be providing guidance through education, filling in gaps where old knowledge may have been lost, and offering the crew a sense of their roots, so to speak. But eventually we see him just solving problems by shooting the biggest troublemakers dead. Ultimately, they reach their target system only to discover that in the intervening 600 years, new technology has allowed for faster ships, and there is already an American colony waiting to pick them up. Everyone takes this as good news, though I would think in a real-life situation there would be somebody who'd be like, you gotta be fucking kidding me. As I said, the story is silly, inescapably dated in the manner of so much pre-World War II pulp SF, with writing that by today's standards just seems amateurish. Yeah, but I didn't hate reading it. As I said, if you take this old pulp stuff on its own terms and are willing to roll with it in the proper historical context, it can be perfectly readable, and sometimes it's possible to admire how little narrative fat these stories have. Editors were keen to ensure their writers got right down to business and never let things wander off on tangents. By the way, you can read every story I mention here at the Internet Archive if you're so inclined. I'll put the links down where the links live. Wilcox's story may be the first proper generation ship story, but we see generation ships as a concept going back even earlier. To give one example, 5 years earlier, in the March 1935 issue of Astounding, I don't actually have that one, Proxima Centuri by Murray Leinster appeared. Now it is, as the title might indicate, the story of a mission to the Earth's closest neighboring star. And while it's not specifically a generation ship story, the massive vessel making the voyage, the Ad Astra, has been fitted out like a world ship, with enough interior space to provide 400 acres of farming. Leinster writes, the Ad Astra was a world in herself. Given power, she could subsist her crew forever, growing her food supplies, purifying her own internal atmosphere without loss and without fail, and containing space within which every human need could be provided, even solitude. The one problem Leinster does foresee is that, with so much meticulous preparation having been done to make sure literally everything runs as smoothly as possible, the crew quickly gets bored, even to the point of mutiny. Anyway, Murray Leinster is a much more highly regarded and fondly remembered Golden Age writer than Don Wilcox ever was, so if you felt like reading this story, then yes, despite the dated elements and old-school writing, you may find it fun. Can we go back further? Yes, we can. Back to the winter 1930 issue of Amazing Stories Quarterly, and a strange tale called TANI of EKKIS, written by someone using the equally strange pen name Aladra Septama. Now that someone was a guy named Judson William Reeves, and to say that information about him is scarce, including when and why he cooked up that pen name, would be an epic understatement. Census information, as well as Ancestry.com, tells us he was born in New York in 1874 and settled for most of his life in California, where he died in Santa Clara in 1950. Amazing Stories Quarterly published half a dozen Aladra Septama stories from 1929 to 1930, after which time Reeves went on to do whatever else his life had in store for him. I don't really recommend TANI of EKKIS. In fact, most of you would probably DNF it after the first paragraph. The prose is absolute torture, in that way that some pulp writers had of mistaking stilted, pretentious word vomit for literary erudition. But the notable twist it adds to the generation ship canon is that it's about an alien generation ship coming to us. You see, the inhabitants of the world of Echis had been living in a near utopia when, shockingly, the entire planet was stricken by a devastating plague of unknown origin. Now, determined to preserve their store of knowledge and culture before everyone drops dead, a ship is designed to make the estimated 500-year journey from Echis to our solar system, the planet Jupiter in particular. Now, we're told it's a distance of 350 trillion miles, and the story doesn't explain how they were able to discover Jupiter in the first place, but then that is about 58 light years, and there's a star 59 light years away from Earth called Gliese 3293, and we know it has 4 planets, so okay, fine. Anyway, I don't recommend the story, which is light on drama and very heavy on wall-of-text technical exposition, and even if you just had to read some science fiction from 95 years ago, I'm sure you could find something much more thrilling. As always, it is the historical interest here that counts. Can we go back further? Yes, we can. If we want to see the very first mention, even if it's just in passing, of the concept of a generation ship, we can go to this novel, A Trip to Venus by John Munro, from 1897, the same year H.G. Wells published The Invisible Man. John Munro was a professor of mechanical engineering from Bristol in the UK, and he wrote 2 early SF stories in addition to A Trip to Venus. This is not a book that comes close to H.G. Wells's level of craft, okay? But you know, for readers interested in the primordial ooze of science fiction, once again, it has that historical notability. And you know, I gotta say, I wish hardcover books still looked like this. I mean, why was this taken from us? A Trip to Venus is probably the first example of what would come to be called planetary romance. The term romance here referring to the romantic movement of the early 1800s, not the love story definition. These were fanciful stories of voyages to other planets in which scientific knowledge, which was pretty limited at the time, to be fair, was basically thrown out the window in favor of maximum vibes, meaning readers would be treated to often dreamlike and hallucinatory travelogues of the imagination. You know, jungles on Venus and wizards on Mars and stuff like that. Other examples of planetary romance, of course, include the John Connor of Mars series by Edgar Rice Burroughs and C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy. More recently, the aesthetic was revived by the Arabella of Mars trilogy by David D. Levine. Again, the story, do not recommend. It's a bland little potato in which 2 astronomers, after the discovery of signals coming from Mars indicates that there may be life on that planet, become determined to travel into space, and then talk about how they might do it for half the book. With the help of a scientist who has developed a form of propulsion that's never really explained, our heroes decide to go to Venus, which, quelle surprise, is inhabited. There's kind of an insta of romance with a virgin Venusian priestess, and then our heroes are nearly sucked into the sun on their way home, oh no, but voila, happy ending. So yeah, nothing to write home about. Although I guess I did just write about it technically. But anyway, in their meandering conversations about spaceflight, one of our heroes does speculate on million-year deep space voyages. With a vessel large enough to contain the necessaries of life, a select party of ladies and gentlemen might start for the Milky Way, and if all went right, their descendants would arrive there in the course of a few million years. Why should we not build large vessels for the navigation of the ether, artificial planets in fact, and go cruising about in space, from universe to universe, on a celestial Cook's excursion? Why indeed? So, as we see, generation ships have captured the imagination of science fiction writers before science fiction itself even had a name. So, I will be continuing my coverage of Generation Ship SF, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, with a combination of my customary single book reviews for newer titles with long-form videos to follow later. So watch for all of that, as well as other regular content coming back to the channel at last, as we move into the second half of the year. But that is all I have time for today. So if you enjoyed watching, please hit that like button, share the video far and wide with all of your SFF reading friends, and above all, please subscribe if you have not done so. That is what helps the channel to grow. Now, don't forget to drop by my Thursday night reading hangout, streaming live at 7:30 Central. You can also support the channel at my Buy Me a Coffee link, and also by clicking the thanks button and leaving a featured comment. All donations to the channel go to help me pay Matt Olson, my immensely talented channel artist who has created all of my incredible thumbnails for nearly 12 years now. No AI art on this channel ever, only Matt's human hands. So once again, thank you all for watching, and until I see you next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and happy reading.